So I want to start by digging into a little bit more about talking about relationships. You all mentioned relationships in one way or another. So I'm wondering if folks could weigh in. How do you build trust? How do you build authentic relationships, which are so critical to achieving all of the work that was discussed? You know, particularly at a time when trust in government is at an all-time low, participation in labor unions and traditional types of associations is declining. Mis and disinformation is easier to spread than ever because of online platforms. So, you know, wondering if a couple of you can talk a little bit about how you go about, strengthening relationships and building trusting relationships. And Janine, I wonder if I could start with you, because we did have an audience member that wanted to better understand what you mean by extractive organizing. And I'm wondering if maybe that would tie into your answer about building strong relationships.
Definitely. So the question was, what is extractive organizing? And I said that Fair Count, we focus on non-extractive organizing. Extractive organizing is going into a community to get what you want from it instead of actually investing and doing long-term power building in that community. So an example of extractive organizing, if I was working on a campaign, or if I'm an elected official and I'm working on a campaign, then I might have organizers, say from Atlanta, that don't know anything about communities in South Georgia. I might parachute those organizers in, collect names, get people to vote, and then I'm gone until the next time I need them. That's extractive. What Fair Count does, and that has been really effective, is to do deep dive organizing. Our organizers live and work in the communities that we work in, and they've been living in these communities since we started. So we have organizers who have been doing one-on-ones, building and maintaining relationships with people for 2 years, and they're still doing that. And because of that deep dive organizing, we've been able to build trust in communities. When we've been able to pivot from the census to voter education and voter engagement, we're using that infrastructure and those relationships that we've built over time we can use those. We're using them now to get people vaccinated and to get information out to people. And we're going to use those same relationships to make sure that there's actual community engagement in the redistricting process. And we can tie all that back together with, our recovery and the importance of having a strong civic infrastructure, because we tell people, and our organizers will tell people, redistricting is boring, right? Nobody's super excited, or it's not the sexiest thing to talk about, but we can say, if you make sure that your voice is heard and that your community isn't packed and cracked and, all of the communities of interest stay together, then you have the power to choose elected officials that will, forward some of the ideas and concerns for you. If you're a community and there's a factory that is polluting your water, and all of y'all are working together and you want to make sure you get an elected official in there that will help design policies and change so that you can get changes at that factory, then you need to make sure that that community isn't broken up during the redistricting process. So I'll stop there, but deep dive organizing, building trust, and investing in communities, I think is the way to go.
Yeah, that's such a helpful way, and I think some good examples to really illustrate that. Do others want to weigh in just on the importance of the importance of building relationships and how you go about building relationships? Atsa?
Sure. Thank you so much. And Janine points out a lot of really key and crucial things. I think for us, a lot of our communities have a large distrust of the government and people coming into their communities in general. So for us, it's, 3, 5, 6 years of really being in the communities and working with people and making sure that we become trusted messengers so that folks know that we're not trying to do anything crazy. And it's really about moving away from that more extractive transactional type of encounter with folks, because we want to make real change. And you can't do that if you don't have people from your community and if you don't have them at the table.
Jean.
So I'd like to just address this from an infrastructure and what levers we have in our different roles. So as a public health governmental official, we have a whole set of tools in our toolbox that we have been using that actually are more transactional, and we can use those very same tools to make more transformational, deeper relationships. And so the examples of extractive, I love that term. When we say, come to our meeting and tell us what we should be doing or advise us, that is not a good investment in terms of building that civic muscle and civic infrastructure, or not as good of a process as identifying who we can and what organizations we can deepen the relationship and invest in, and have a plan that goes over a longer period of time, so that it's not just a one-off and here's a thing and an advisory moment. And that means that we have all these different ways that we can do our work that we can just be using. And so when I think about infrastructure, I think that funders have it, governmental agencies have it, academic institutions have it, and it's a matter of how we lead with investing in the people and the relationships that of the people who have been most impacted by inequities.
Archon, please.
Yeah, I think these are great thoughts and strategies. I just maybe have two additional small things to add. One is that I think it would really help for the desire to build a constructive relationship to be infused throughout public agencies and throughout public service in a way that it's not necessarily done now in everywhere. And I think, just I think that if you look at environmental agencies under some administrations and in some states, they really are good. They kind of get environmental justice. They're good at building those relationships with organizations, with community organizations. Other environmental agencies don't do that. It's not part of their culture. And so I think like the invitation from the public sector is really, really important. And then a second dimension is power sharing, is that public agencies and public officials really, I think, can take a step forward in building positive relationships by showing that they're willing to share power in the sense of giving community members and citizens who try to engage real voice and influence over the stuff that happens, over agency decisions and determinations.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and relates to another question I had just in terms of thinking about some of the institutions, specifically philanthropy and government. I think the philanthropic sector and governments can be powerful forces for change, but these institutions can also reinforce inequities through the ways in which they develop priorities or silo work in ways that undermine intersectionality and how they distribute resources. So I'm wondering if some of our panelists can talk about what are some of the ways that funders and government institutions can be better partners in both centering equity and in strengthening our civic infrastructure. Who wants to jump in first here? Atza.
I think, for us, there's a couple of things. One, I think coming into the table as equals, I think is key. A lot of times in our communities, it comes as like we're trying to save people, and that never really comes off really well. For us, it's also, having more general funding and longer terms and larger amounts. When people come in and say, here's 10,000 and they want you to work this miracle, that's not enough to really fund anyone. there needs to be ongoing funding, and those 2 to 3 years prevents some of these smaller nonprofits from spending all of their time just doing grant applications and then grant reporting. So I think being more open, especially during COVID, to having a review that is online and Zoom to prevent us from having to write all of these reports is important, and just being open to the process that there are other ways to do stuff and moving away again from that extractive mindset, I think are key and crucial to communities.
I 100% agree with everything Ata said. I think the other thing that I would say, especially about, for philanthropic funders and, at the government level, a lot of times, especially when there are large pots of money, the money goes to larger groups that have proven over time that they're effective. But I do think that there are a lot of grassroots groups that are not large, but they're small but mighty. And I think that especially with government funding, there needs to be, even if some of that money needs to go to these smaller groups and give these groups an opportunity to prove them, that they can get this work done. But I think a lot of times you get these big pots of money and they're divvied up among much larger organizations that aren't as effective on the grassroots level.
And Mira, I'm wondering if you can weigh in here, especially thinking about, sort of like school governments, especially, we just heard from these two fabulous young people who are helping to, inform local government bodies to try and make them more responsive to the needs of young people, more responsive to the needs of their communities. So I'm wondering, maybe what does this look like a little bit at the local level? And you can use education as an example or not.
Yeah, thank you, Jocelyn. I was thinking about your question because education is this interesting space in which we actually have some very large philanthropic organizations, Gates, Broad, Walton, to name 3, that have had a really outsized influence on education policy and practice in ways that arguably they've certainly not strengthened, right, democratic control and voice over schools or through schools. And in fact, in many ways, they've enacted somewhat of a replacement of public deliberation over what kind of society we are and want to become through our schools with, in fact, philanthropic, very, very large philanthropies making those decisions often on communities' behalves. And so it's an interesting dynamic, I think, within education where we've started to see potentially some shifting back. It's been interesting, say that you may remember the Red for Ed campaigns from a couple of years ago, as teachers unions in red states, blue states, and purple states started to assert themselves in ways that they hadn't in quite a while. And I think we are seeing, thanks to, in part, the respect for youth outpouring, both in terms of the Dreamers working for years, also post-Parkland with the March for Our Lives and the growth in youth organizing that we saw out of that, and Black Lives Matter and the very, very strong youth organizing there, the strong youth organizing and the anti-DAPL, et cetera, that there's really been this huge connection among youth organizers that they are also, they're also directing towards education and towards schools. So I think we may be at a new moment in democratic engagement in and through schools by youth as well as by communities, but we still do have the grand behemoths of some of the largest concentrations of private wealth in the world that are really quite concerned about American schools and still have a lot of impact on them. So I think it's a real question as to how the civic infrastructure is going to go.
Jean, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think, I guess I just want to clearly assert that in order for us to get advanced health equity, we have to center our work, and I'm talking again from a governmental or a professional public health perspective, we have to center our work in intentionally building power with the people who are most impacted by health inequities. And that's very different work than figuring out what the needs are and how we get some money to do something for some of the people. And this idea or this understanding of intentionally building our power and using those tools that we have in our portfolio of organizing the data and the knowledge and the story with who we're having those conversations with, and organizing resources and policies so that we're actually investing in the organizations that are on the ground and in long-term relationship. And being clear that you can't, we have to recognize that people there needs to be containers for power. So we can't just expect that people are going to show up on an issue. We have to have a long-term investment in the relationships of the organizations that are committed to doing this work. And all of that is not in everyday practice in terms of the way we measure our success, but can and should be if we're going to be moving forward. And that's the way I think about what the civic infrastructure looks like. But just waking up every day and knowing that our job is to strengthen someone else's ability to make something happen. Some other organization, not solve the problem today from my office, but figure out who is in a position and what kind of reports and tools and data do they need? What kinds of resources do they need? That completely changed my own practice. And I think that's what it looks like from my perspective of what government can do differently.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Janine. So I want to, some of these issues can feel a little, amorphous. There's so many definitions. The ecosystem is complicated. So I want to try and concretize some of these concepts a little bit with some specific examples. And, what can we learn from these specific examples that can sort of inform how we think about work moving forward. And Arkan, I wonder if we could start with you and go back to the Flint water crisis for a moment. There was a question that came in that asked if, if you can offer more detail on the barriers. Oops, sorry, that wasn't the full question. Let's see. Bear with me just a minute. Here we go. What was the specific breakdown of civic infrastructure that led to the groups not being heard by government? Can you offer more detail on that? And also, what can we learn from that to inform work moving forward?
Yeah. It could take a long time to tell the Flint story, so I'll just tell a couple of pieces of it that are very relevant to today's discussion. One is that what gets the Flint water crisis going in the first place is an emergency manager rule in Michigan that basically takes democracy away from communities that can't pay their bills, right? And instead of, they don't get a city council, they get an emergency manager that's appointed by the governor, whose main job it is to balance the budget, no matter what the cost. And in this case, one of the costs turned out to be switching Flint to a water supply that would end up contaminating the lead. And most of the communities in Michigan, at least half of them subject to the emergency manager provision, are predominantly communities of color. And so that's a very democracy relevant kind of piece of background is, if you can't balance the books because you happen to be a community that's low income and predominantly of color, you don't get democracy, local democracy. And the city council voted, at least once overwhelmingly say, we don't want this water, but they didn't get to do that because somebody else was in charge. So that's one big barrier. That's pretty specific to municipal government, right? A lot of states have emergency manager provisions. That one's specific to city government. one that's more general, part of the Flint story that is just appears in just about every environmental justice crisis is that you have some claims of contamination and poisoning going on. You have some people in the community saying, hey, this water is not clean, the well's not good, the air's not good. What in Flint, it happened to be the water, right? And people are saying that. And then you have officials. And in this case, it was the State Department of Environment and the sewage district that said, no, the water's fine. We've tested it. It's fine. There's no problem here. And as a matter of fact, people often, like, it's performative. They'll go to city council meetings. They'll say, this water's so clean, I'll drink a glass of it, whatever, right? And then the next kind of move that happens in a lot of these cases is that communities get allies of external scientists who do kind of community-based science, kind of popular epidemiology, some people have called it, where they take their own water samples, they do their own analysis, and this is exactly what happened in Flint, and they come up with a very, very different result. Guess what? Our studies show that the water is contaminated. And then so you have counter expertise going on. And then sometimes the counter expertise gets enough voice and it gets enough attention, as it did in Flint, to blow the top off, and then finally some better things happen, right? So that's a kind of case in which it's completely typical that the disadvantaged community voice that is pointing out serious health and environmental problems is ignored because the people whose job it is to analyze the data come up with a different answer. They just don't believe what's happening to the people in these communities. And then so sometimes the people in the communities are wrong, but sometimes they're right. And something systematic really is going on. And what they have to do is make the case, oftentimes in alliance with other scientists and counter expertise who's willing to join with them and try to listen really hard to what they're saying and do the analysis do a different analysis that oftentimes comes up with very different results.
Great, thank you. And I want to dig into a couple of more examples and what we can learn from them, specifically from last year. And it's a bit of moderator privilege, since my work at FCCP last year was really focused on the census and helping to educate and mobilize funders to invest in trusted community leaders to try and get the most fair and accurate count possible, especially with the focus on folks that had been historically undercounted, and also do a lot of work on redistricting, again, also trying to make sure that folks that have been historically underrepresented are really centered and at the table as maps are being drawn. So Asa, I wonder if we could go to you next. I'd love to hear a little bit more about either the census work or the election work from last year, and what can we learn from all of the mobilization and organizing that happened through that work last year, especially all of the ways in which communities had to pivot as a result of the COVID pandemic. We know that the extent to which communities are fairly represented, counted, and represented, and have the opportunity to elect somebody from that community has really profound implications on policies and resources, including for health. So just want to help to kind of make that connection, and would love for you to share any learnings or insights from the work last year.
Sure, thank you so much. So in New Mexico, 78% of the Native Americans reside in what the census would call a hard to count area. So we had a really robust plan for how we were going to infiltrate all of these communities with all of our census counters to really, make sure that everyone was counted. In New Mexico, each person was worth $50,000 that was counted for our community. So we started the NM Native Census Coalition, which was the first in the state to work with every single tribal nation, as well as our urban relatives. And it was a huge undertaking. I mentioned before we use geo tracking to get into our communities. When we're able to walk our communities, we get to between 85 to 95% response, right? But for my community, Giwa Pueblo, which is about 5,500 people, when we used the data that was available to contact them, we were only reaching 8% of the population. So there is a very big lack of data on our communities that needs to be addressed in the future. We had issues with some of our communities not even receiving their packets until July and August. So in one community, we had one day to get people enumerated and in the community because of COVID. So we had a really big challenge trying to get everyone counted, but we had weekly meetings to keep everyone engaged. We had a really robust social media platform. We did things like dinner and a show. We created a coloring book for our kids, because we know, like, if my nephews or nieces bug me about something because they're aware of it, I'm going to do it. So we utilized all kinds of stuff during the elders and the youth meals service. We provided flyers. We did all kinds of things to make sure that we got every single person counted. We even had folks in the side of the road providing supplies to folks, you know, like bluebird flour, bags of potatoes and stuff like that, gas cards, to incentivize people to just get counted. Right now, with some of the data that's coming through, we see that there's an increase in the population, but we still believe that there's largely an undercount. We think that we present closer to 15 to 18% of the total population of the state of New Mexico. Right now, it's at 11%. So as Janine was mentioning before, you use that same kind of infrastructure that you build. So that's what we also, you know, added with our election folks and phone lists and stuff like that. And we're continuing that effort with redistricting. So it's all cyclical for us in terms of making sure that we bring our communities, we educate our communities, so that we really do have that voice at the table. And because we're unique in the state where we have a C3, a C4, and a PAC, we're able to use those different tools when necessary to make sure that we advocate moving forward. But when you talk about, you know, healthy democracy and healthy communities, it really starts with having that voice and having everyone engage civically so that we come as a collective. We've also started to work with some of the other BIPOC organizations in the state and build larger collective coalitions. So a good example of that is that we passed the Sustainable Economy Bill, which basically creates a task force of folks to move New Mexico out of oil and gas and into renewable energies, which affects our community's health. And so when we came together with all of these other organizations across the state, we were able to push that legislation through. And now we have 8 positions in a committee of 18 people for our tribal nations, so that we do have that voice to move forward.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point that I think is worth being really explicit about here, which is there are so many different ways that we can use census organizing and organizing around elections and redistricting as both important in and of themselves to achieve fair representation and community representation, but also strategies to build long-term power, to strengthen coalitions, to help educate communities about all of the ways that they can advocate for themselves and their communities. So I think that's such an important point. And Janine, I know Fair Count has also done incredible work around census and the elections and redistricting. So wondering if you could give, an example or two what we can learn from the work of your organization in the last year.
Definitely. I'd say those are some. I might borrow a couple of those ideas because that's really amazing work that y'all are doing down there. Very similar. We had a lot of, we had to pivot very quickly. One of the things that we had planned, we had actually started in Georgia, was a 60 county in-person bus tour. We weren't going to big cities. We were going to tiny little, small towns. And we were, I think we got through 6 of those in-person stops before we had to shut everything down because of the pandemic. But we try to be scrappy. And we ended up taking that bus tour and turning it into a virtual bus tour where we did, online events. We had local speakers and trusted voices come on to, talk about the census and the importance of the census. We did online backyard parties around Juneteenth where we had a DJ who would, play music and then pause and remind people to complete the census. And then, sort of taking it back to public health, obviously we were in the middle of a pandemic. We were able to partner with another organization, E Pluribus Unum, and we did our Road to Recovery census bus tour, which went across 6 states in the South. And we did very similar things. We'd have our stops in Mississippi, my hometown. We did a family reunion with my family in Mississippi, and we talked about the importance of the census. My parents talked about how they remembered the census, and so we had these conversations. We did work in Louisiana and Florida and Alabama and North Carolina and South Carolina, and so we did this virtual bus tour. And I think that the other thing, and I'll just end with this, is that you also have to meet people where they are. These bus tours weren't just Zooms. We work in a lot of rural communities. And so I know that Jean knows, coming from a rural community, I'm from South Mississippi. We didn't live on a farm, but we had cows. And so in our yard, but, when we were working in rural communities where we knew that in Georgia alone, at least 20% of households didn't have internet access. And so we knew that we weren't going to reach people by doing Zooms. And so we really focused on teletown halls where we would call up to 100,000 phone numbers, have local voices and trusted leaders and have these interactive conversations where people could press a button and ask the panel a question. And so it was just, I think you have to meet people where they are and also just be creative. One thing we're not afraid to do is to throw everything at the wall. Rebecca DeHart, our CEO, will say this all the time. We will throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. And so I think that regardless of whether you're doing it for, civic engagement, for, to get people engaged in health policy and to fight health disparities, I think we just have to be really creative and bold in the things that we try.
Yeah, I think the theme of sort of meeting people where they are is really important. One of the things that we talked about a little bit in our prep call was some of the ways in which strategies to strengthen civic and health infrastructure differ based on different geographies, urban, rural, tribal. There's different access to political levers, different vehicles for relationship building and problem solving. So wondering if anybody wants to comment on what opportunities do you see for advancing civic infrastructure and health equity in different types of geographies? Does anyone want to weigh in on that?
I could potentially weigh in on it as a way of actually also getting into, I know one of the questions that
Great.
up in their question. So, what I think that this point is really super important, that there is not just like one best way of engaging civically, right? That we need a huge repertoire at our fingertips in order both ourselves to engage civically, because what the moment calls for at one point might be, reaching out to our neighbor and seeing, if they need help with the tree that's fallen down during the storm. At another time is reaching out to our city councilor. At a third time is joining the protest. At a fourth time is writing an amicus brief, right? Like there's all sorts of different things that we may need to do in order to make change or to help our communities be stronger at any moment. And then these also do differ by geography, by relationships of power, by race, by ethnicity, by legal status, etc. And so I think one of the things, so taking it to schools, I think it's really crucial if we hope to strengthen the civic infrastructure that young people learn and get a chance to practice this repertoire of strategies, right? So just as in mathematics, we say, okay, well, you don't want to have only one strategy at your fingertips, right? You don't only want to have to work through the algorithm. It may be that what you want to do is some estimation and then figuring out and get closer in, or you might want to be able to do a formal proof, or you need to work collaboratively and reason your way together, or change it to an applied problem, et cetera. Those are the kinds of things that we need to do in our civic work, and help students experience those, practice those, learn when to pull what from their toolbox, have experience with it, including having experience that, say, as Aidan was talking about in the youth panel, of getting really bored and thinking, oh my gosh, do I really have to sit through this 5-hour meeting? And the answer is, yeah, sometimes you do, right? And unfortunately, you're going to sit through lots of 5-hour meetings, because that is the way that we'll get change. Right now, there's this really, I think, quite worrisome, both exciting and really worrisome sort of inflection point, though, in American public education, where there's both a recognition that we should be doing more to educate young people and have them actually experience doing citizenship and practicing citizenship, the same way that they experience writing and reading and doing math and practicing, science experiments and playing baseball, right? So we have states like Massachusetts and Illinois and Florida and Oklahoma that have passed laws that have said, we want students doing citizenship. We want them practicing citizenship by, say, taking civic action and actually getting credit for that. In fact, we expect students to do that. We expect students to be engaged in service learning in other states and so forth. But there's also right now a very significant pushback against that. And so there's in 21 different states, there have been recent efforts, some of them have been successful, to actually restrict student engagement in civic action and civic skills development. And that's been really related also to learning about race and thinking about personal identity and thinking about the history of race and racism in this country, in part because, as we've heard, Atsa explain and heard Janine explain and so forth, heard Jean explain that it is about, actually, so much of this is about identity and who you are and where you are, and collaborating in solidarity with others to make change. And so we're seeing actually now a backlash in many states that are trying to prevent schools and prevent teachers from engaging students in this work. And so I think that's a real threat to our future civic infrastructure if this succeeds, in terms of not enabling students to think about who they are, what communities they're part of, and what repertoires they have available to them to try to engage, as Archon was talking about, in the people exercising power in the heart of democracy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And change is certainly not linear. I think you're seeing, a pushback that could be described similarly around, access to the ballot. So I think, again, progress is not linear, and that's why creating long-term power by organizations, at the local level that have trust and live in those communities is so critical to everything that we're talking about. So let's actually circle back and talk a little bit more explicitly about equity, because I think all of you have either touched on it or referenced it in one way or another. And one of our sort of grounding assertions for this discussion really implies that exclusion creates bad outcomes for health and for democracy. There's a lot of talk right now about the importance of equity, but it doesn't always show up in ways that are meaningful. And so I'm wondering if any of our panelists can talk a little bit about really specifically how you center and operationalize equity in your work. Anyone like to start? Arkan. You're on mute.
I wanted to tie the equity discussion in with a little bit with some of the redistricting work. It had kind of, and this kind of goes to an idea that I think the civic infrastructure and civic engagement world in the United States is very, very bottom up, right? We pay a lot of attention to what's going on in communities and organizing people. And I just wanted to spend just a minute on the top-down aspect of it, that I think we should pay more, a little kind of top-down aspect. And by that, I mean, a lot of places outside of the United States, and in some contexts inside the United States, you see actual rulemaking and decision-making bodies that incorporate a fair amount of citizen and civic voice. And so let me just take an example from redistricting, right? So in most states in the United States, it's the state legislature that draws the district maps. And so, you know, you could have the best census count in the world and they can still Mickey Mouse around with the maps, and they do, in order to make sure that the people who are sitting in the legislature, when they make the maps, have a good chance of being there at the next election, right? To entrench incumbent power. In some states, especially in California, but also in Michigan and a few other states, they actually have, the districts maps are drawn by citizens. Like in California, it's the Citizens Redistricting Commission, and anybody can apply to be on that commission. And then they pick some people, and it's like some capital R Republicans and some capital E Democrats, but most people are independent, and they draw the maps, just like kind of ordinary citizens who apply, right? And so it's kind of empowering the civic, in this case, to draw the electoral maps, which is like a fair amount of power, right? In Brazil, in every city, I think it's probably going a little less well now, but for a while, I think there was some places going quite well. Every city has a municipal health council with civic representatives and professional representatives of doctors and public health people, and they do a bunch of the policy making around municipal public health and healthcare, right? In some cities in Latin America and in a few districts in the parts of cities in the United States, they have participatory budgeting, where ordinary people kind of get to propose projects and spend public money. So these are ways of thinking a little bit more top down about ambitious initiatives, which like create a seat at the table for people and civic organizations and impulses to actually exercise power. And I think it's worth us spending part of our minds on that kind of activity, in addition to all of the super important grassroots bottom-up activity that's kind of our bread and butter.
That's great. And Mir, I wanted to ask you a question, because there was a question that I think you started to touch on when you talked a little bit more about, when you talked about some of the backlash to some of the education policy change that's happening across the country. But I just want to uplift this question that came in. And it says, it's referring to the teaching of history and probably civics, and specifically a book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. It's shown that the way we in the past and currently teach these subjects tends to promulgate focus on promoting racism and inequity. Can you comment on how this should be changed?
Sure. It's a very challenging question, and a really, really important one. We have always in this country been engaged in a discussion about how we tell our past as a way of shaping how we understand our present and hope to tell or construct our future. So, and schools are a really significant site of that future building through the construction and telling of the past, right? And so schools are these really interesting pieces of civic infrastructure that are both trying to build the infrastructure for the future, right? But are sites also of civic contestation in the present, right? And one of the things that is really contested right now in public view is how we understand the present, how we understand the inequities of COVID, the environmental inequities, economic inequities, political inequities, et cetera, through our past, right? Through histories of enslavement, of Jim Crow past and present, of Native American genocide, et cetera, right? Of xenophobia, and you know, how we understand our history as a way of understanding our present in part shapes therefore what we think our policies and our practices should be moving forward. And this overall debate that we're having in the country about how we understand where we've been, what that means for where we are, and how we chart our way forward is also being contested in schools, right? And it is a site of democratic contestation, as well as being a contestation about who we are as and who we should be as a democracy. And so this question, therefore, about how should we teach about racism and inequity, and then the claim that some people are making that actually too strong a focus on teaching about racism and inequity actually promotes and continues racism and inequity, right? Because there is this argument that says that say to quote from Justice Roberts' decision in Parents United in the 2007 Supreme Court decision about voluntary desegregation efforts that took race into account, that the Supreme Court overturned. The argument was the best way, I'm actually getting the phrase slightly wrong, maybe that one of you can correct me, but like the best way to get past racism is to stop talking about race, right? Like that's how we will get past race being an issue. And, you know, other people argue, and I'm on these other people's side, that I just think that's wrong, right? That silence about, say, racial inequities and racism in our country doesn't actually help get us past race. It helps to entrench the racial inequities that have been built in to our superstructure, our structure, and our grassroots ways of working for a long time. But there is a huge amount of disagreement right now about what we should be teaching children as a way of defining who we are as a country and how we should move forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I know that's a big question that would certainly take more than the time we had today to answer. So we're starting to run a little low on time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a couple of questions that have come in from the audience at once. And if folks want to take sort of a brief stab at answering one or the other, that way we can try and get through a couple more audience questions. One question is, what do you think about requiring community members on boards of companies or in political leadership positions? So any thoughts on that question? And another question that came in was, were local successes for civic engagement effective when addressing COVID vaccinations? So anyone want to take a jump in and try and provide a brief answer to either question?
Sure, I can go ahead and jump in really quickly on the COVID vaccinations. Our tribal communities were incredibly prepared for that. We had some of the first vaccinations come into our communities. As you know, the Navajo Nation per capita was the largest affected in the nation. And so right now, I think on Friday, we saw that we have we just surpassed the 1 million mark for Native Americans in the country being vaccinated. In the state, we're almost at 100% in our tribal communities, and they've reached out to their urban communities as well. So we've even had people who are non-tribal members being asked to come in and get their COVID vaccinations to protect our communities. So it's been largely positive out in these communities in New Mexico.
Great. Other examples on whether or not local successes for civic engagement were effective when addressing COVID vaccinations, or anyone want to weigh in on whether or not we should require community members on either company boards or in political leadership?
I want to answer the political leadership one. I think it's a little too simple to suggest that a community representative should be on a board, and then check that off as a box. My experience is that we often have about, like as a public health agency, maybe 15 to 20 people that are on everything. And they end up representing viewpoints, and they may be very helpful, but they might not have anybody behind them that they can get to show up at the meeting when you have to have a actual creating some accountability. And so I think that more attention to the process of decision making and commitment to the way we are engaging long term is as important as saying that there needs to be community participation. I mean, I think it's important to say, yes, there should be community participation, but it's all not equal in terms of its impact. And I think in morning's speaker talked about our work has to be consequential. It should be consequential, and we should be making sure that the people who are there have an opportunity to actually wield influence at that table.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jean. One of the other questions that came in was, what are the most effective arguments that organizers can use to encourage investment from these and other funding institutions, I think referring to both philanthropy and government, to build relationships and power to advance health equity? And I'll just say that FCCP as an organization, this is something that is core and central to all of the work that we do and that our funders do, and that we are trying to push the field of philanthropy to do, which is to not just invest in specific topics, to not just invest around the boom and bust cycles of elections, but to invest in organizations and communities in ways that can build long-term power and resiliency, to really shift the balance of power, to put trust in those that are on the ground, that know their communities and their issues and are doing this work day in and day out. So would love to have an entire conversation just about that. And it's a really important question that I think is central to all of this work. So we're going to end. I'm going to pose one final question for all of our final panelists. I think it's clear, which is I think just related to what I was just saying, that we need to support civic infrastructure in a long-term sustained way, just like we do our physical infrastructure. We can't just think about these issues in separate buckets, but as an interconnected ecosystem in which we need to invest. And only then can we really achieve an open and equitable democracy and health structure that we're all striving for. So the last question that I would like each of our panelists to answer is, and I want to end on a really positive note here, because I know these issues are hard and they're weighty, and the ecosystem is constantly changing, and progress is not linear, and we're always going to face collective challenges together. So what gives you hope? Or what's our best opportunity to advance health and democracy in this country? And I'll just go based on where you all are on my screen. So Archon, I'll start with you.
I think the best hope or the foundation is our experience in the pandemic. I think that what the last 14 months makes really clear is that communities and individuals engaged have a huge role to play in keeping ourselves healthy, and that we can't count on government acting alone or public health officials acting alone. Remember, the CDC and the WHO were the people who told you not to wear a mask till April, right? And that a huge amount of how well communities did was how well they took care of each other and cared about things like social distancing and were able to regulate their behavior for the sake of the community, and as well as families and individuals. And then third of all, of course, the health equity aspect is the pandemic has just made clear the burdens of this disease are born extremely unequally, and what generates that equality has more than anything to do with equalizing voice and equalizing power. And I think those lessons will stay with us for quite a while.
Thank you. Atsa, we'll go to you next.
Sure. I think the things that is most hopeful for me is really being able to see this reawakening of youth wanting to engage civically, and also with the appointment of Deb Haaland as the Secretary of Interior, the election of Sheriff Davis. We're starting to see more Native representation which really matters when you're thinking about changing the narrative of this vanishing Native or these people that are long gone. We are still here. We're very much alive, and we are just creating these coalitions nationally so that we can continue to engage civically, and so that our voices are heard and people know what the needs are of our community. So that's what gives me a lot of hope.
Thank you. Mira?
Sure. Thanks, Jocelyn. I guess sticking with schools, what I would say is I think one of the positive outcomes of COVID is that what has finally become visible, I think, to everybody, and not solely to activists who are already thinking this way, are the ways in which environmental health and justice tracks so closely economic health and justice, tracks so closely political health and justice, and tracks so closely educational health and justice that activists have said for a long time that, if we are in favor of one thing, we have to be in favor of justice in all of these other areas too, because they're so interconnected. And I think that now, as we've seen these connections, that schools are such visible sites of inequity, but also of possibility. We see health as deeply related to that, and democracy is related to that. And so I'm hoping there will be a commitment on a much broader scale to synergies and to moving all of these ahead simultaneously.
We'll go Jean, and then Janine will have the last word. Oh, Jean, you're on mute.
The growing, just what Mira said, the growing sort of engagement around the need to advance health equity, and growing clarity that being intentionally engaged in building power is happening. And people have lots of experiences around it. And it was the first election cycle that I saw deeper commitments to infrastructure occurring across the whole spectrum. And I'm hopeful that we will bring that to assuring access to the ballot for all right now.
All right. I think what gives me hope, and maybe this is because I'm an evolutionary biologist, is seeing change over time. And whether that change is talking to a member of a community who knows what the American Community Survey is and is looking out for, that mailer to come in, whether it's someone that wants to help draw maps for redistricting, whether it's, and even with kids, y'all probably have seen my kid come in here, but when my kids talk about the importance of voting, it's seeing those changes over time in these communities, knowing that they're leading to bigger and greater things. And that gives me hope. And that's what I'll cling on to when things look dark. I go back to all of these positive spots that we've been able to see in just the few years that I've been in this space.
Well, thank you so much to all of our speakers and all of our participants. That's a wrap for today. We hope to see you tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern. We hope you took a lot from all of today's discussion. I know that I'm really inspired coming away from this specific discussion. We know that systems and structures don't evolve on their own, but hopefully you got some great strategies and ideas, and were as inspired as I was by all of the incredible work that our speakers are doing. So thank you so much.